Welcome to the Get to Know Your IDA podcast. I am your host, Robbie Ann McPherson. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director for the Erie County Industrial Development Agency. And we do this podcast to dispel myths, to talk about misinformation that's out there about IDAs, and to point out the ways that your IDA actually helps the community and helps your economic stability. And there are other services we provide too, which a lot of people don't know about. Today, as our guest, we have a special treat. You know, I always love it when we have board members on our podcast because we get a special insight into, as they say, how the sausage gets made. So today, please welcome our guest, Mr. Richard Lipsitz. He is our board vice chair and serves as the chair of our policy committee. Very important job. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Robbie. I'm happy to be here.
So we have so much to talk about today. I feel like, now that I've got you, we have like a million questions and a million things to discuss. So, but let's start out for those of you who may not be familiar with you and your work. Why don't you describe a little bit about your labor background and where you've been basically for the last umpteen years?
I began my career as a labor leader in 1979, and I had one staff position or elected position in the labor movement pretty much continuously since that period of time, right up until my retirement in 2021. So I had a career of about 42 years. I was a union steward. I was a union local president. I was a political action coordinator for the Joint Council of Teamsters. I was a business agent for two separate unions. And I finished my career on the staff of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters Training and Development Department out of Washington, where I traveled the country on behalf of the International, and as president of the Western New York Area Labor Federation. That's the AFL-CIO's umbrella organization from Batavia down to Jamestown, including the cities of Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Dunkirk, Jamestown, Olean. So I've had a full career.
That's a full career. That is definitely an experienced labor negotiator. Right. And I'm gonna take a wild guess that those negotiating skills help you in your role as vice chair on the ECIDA board.
Yeah, they've helped me in almost every aspect of the career that I pursued. I still pursue, although I'm now the president emeritus of the Western New York Area Labor Federation, which is an honorific, but which I do participate in some decisions and some programs of the Federation, even now as a retired president. But I considered this work on the ECIDA as an adjunct to my role as president of the AFL-CIO in Western New York, and as adjunct to my role at the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. So to answer your question, every skill that you develop, if you're good at what you do, can be applied to a whole realm of your activities as a human being, but especially those which have relevance to the work that you made your career, which the labor movement has relevance to how public money is spent and or how public subsidies are used. And I attempt still to this day to use those skills to effectuate policies and programs that actually help ordinary people in any realm. And that includes when we involve ourselves in political elections and social fights. And unfortunately, sometimes tragedies like what happened on Jefferson on May 14th and other such activities over my career. So yes, the answer to your question is those things have come into use at the ECIDA.
And you kind of have a dual role with the ECIDA because you serve as our vice chair, but you also serve as the chair of our policy committee. So, and we're going to talk about some of the things you vote on as vice chair, et cetera, and and how some of that works in a minute. But let's look at your role as chair of the policy committee. So, and for those of you who are not familiar, an application, when someone applies for ECIDA incentives, let's say, the application goes through a process. Every applicant has to go through the same process. And one of the stops on the way to approval or not approval with a board vote is a stop at the policy committee, where the policy committee looks through the application, considers the material terms. Usually there's a representative of the applicant there who can answer questions, etc. And over the past 8 years, having sat in on many, many, many policy committee meetings, I can tell you that if you want to know exactly how the IDA works, listening to those meetings, which are public, by the way, they're all live streamed, that's a great way to do it. So let's start there. So a project comes before you, Richard, and the packet, which is sometimes 2 inches thick of details, that is placed in front of you. And tell us how you go about reviewing and guiding the policy committee through some of these steps.
Right. Well, you're correct. The packet that is related to the application for a potential tax incentive or abatement is given to the policy members, at least I would guess, in almost every case, about a week before the policy meeting. Mm-hmm. So everybody on the committee has an opportunity to actually review, and based on my experience with the committee, I think that's what's done. I think everybody looks at it, myself included.
Definitely.
And so you have a very sophisticated group of people who come together on a monthly basis and look carefully at these applications, both from the point of view as do they follow the statute which governs ECIDA or IDAs around the state, and whether or not they also follow some policies which the ECIDA board has put into place to either enhance an incentive or to reject an incentive. We have to follow the statutory limits set by the original law, which was passed all the way back in 1971 on industrial development agencies. But we also have to pay attention to any modifications of that, which were passed by the legislature in Albany and signed into law by the governor. Mm-hmm. Those things have to be taken into consideration. And then the actual application is reviewed by the committee. The committee is open for full democratic discussion by all those who are members of the committee. Everybody has a right to speak. Everybody has a right to hear their opinion. Nobody has to vote yes on any particular application. However,
that's true.
If it follows the statutes and it follows our policies, and we've given incentives before, then generally such an application is approved by the committee. But that doesn't end the process. Then that recommendation, whether it's up, down, or there's no recommendation, I haven't had that happen in the 10 years or so that I've been chair, or 9 years I've been chair, but it goes to the full board. Whatever the decision is, goes to the full board. Mm-hmm. Then the full board has the same opportunity to review the application, look at the recommendation of the policy committee, and then there's a vote. And if the vote is affirmative, at that point, then the resolution for a abatement or an incentive is passed. That's how it works. So I feel that it's, I take pride in the fact that people have a right to speak. And we've had some very vigorous debates and discussions over the years.
Yes.
And I feel good about that too. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it should be run too top down, but I also think there has to be leadership through the process. Otherwise, you could sit there and never come to a conclusion on any of these programs or applications. And so we haven't done that. We've been thoughtful and prompt. Sometimes it gets sent back to the committee for further discussion. Not too often, but sometimes by the full board. If that happens, we take up whatever the issue is there. We also deal with things when there's recapture. If, for example, there's a promise of job creation that does not come to fruition, then a report is made by a compliance officer through the executive director, and we take a look at that. And we may actually have to recommend a vote to withdraw the incentive to have a recapture of the abatement or the incentive, depending on what it is.
Sure.
Those things happen as well. And the third thing that we do generally is we look at policy modifications or new policies, things like pay equity, which was quite controversial at the time, about 6 years ago, but which was passed by the board. Things like local labor, which I could get into, but was passed further back than that, probably 7 or 8 years. And I think both of them have been substantially good for our community, and it allows for the best use of these incentives that make a difference for, like I said before, ordinary people. You haven't asked me, do I think that every company that comes for an application necessarily needs it? Well, that yes and no, and that depends on what their application says, but whether they are qualified, whether they quote need it or not.
True, and I think there's also a bit of a spectrum in the definition of need too.
That's right. That's right.
Sometimes a project sometimes a project will fall apart without incentives. It just won't work and it doesn't move forward. Other times it's a delay. A company could miss a construction season. Sometimes there's a scale issue. Without incentives, we have to scale back the project. So I think a lot of people sort of miss that nuance, and that's part of what the policy committee talks about. And I'd love to go back to what you mentioned about recapture too, because every single recapture case is unique. Every business is unique. Sometimes we have had in the past bad actors who, didn't follow policy, and they were, they didn't notify us and the things they were supposed to notify us, et cetera, and they were recaptured, so the incentives were paid back. Then there are other situations where there's a global pandemic, as we just experienced the last 2 years. And still other scenarios where maybe an industry has a downturn. And each one of those comes before the policy committee. So tell us a little bit about, we'll go back to the scenario. So you get a recapture case plunked in front of you. What is it that you're looking for?
Well, let's say that there was a promise of the creation of, sake of argument, 100 jobs. Mm-hmm. And in order not to have a recapture, the applicant has to produce those 100 jobs. I think 90% of 100 if it's over 50, 95% if it's under 50. I don't remember the exact policy.
Right. There are definite hard guidelines.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But so the report is made to the committee that the applicant is falling short. We have a responsibility to do complete diligence on this, complete investigation, find out what the cause of it is, and then perhaps recapture based on what the analysis shows. Now, we had years ago one which was very famous that I think they didn't even try to get to they took the incentive, they rebuilt something. I don't remember the details exactly, Robbie, but they took the incentive, didn't come close to the jobs required, and in fact went out of business after they had taken the incentive. Mm-hmm. We went after them, and we got back, and we got the money back.
Right.
And I think that's an example of us doing our job properly. As is, on the other side, a company that has no control over something that falls short, perhaps close but not completely. We've done things like do a percentage of a recapture, not a full recapture. Or but I don't recall anyone that we've absolutely forgiven a recapture up to this point in my tenure. There may be one or two. I would guess that COVID and its outcomes, depending on how it impacts the economy, could have some, deleterious effect going forward in case a company can't make an employment figure. Yeah. There are other things that could come in front of us. A company that didn't tell us the truth about their application. For example, we had an example of a company that was behind on its back taxes, and we went through this carefully, and that company had to pay up their back taxes in order
property taxes.
That's property taxes, not their personal income tax, the property taxes. And when it was done, then the incentive went through. But we perform a policing, it's policy, but we also perform something of a policing role. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't want that to sound too strong. I don't want people to freak out over it, but it's the right way to look at these things. This is money that isn't written as a check from the ECIDA to a company for an incentive. Correct. But the company doesn't pay the same amount in tax, depending on the type of incentive or the abatement. Abatement has to do with pilots, payment in lieu of taxes, property taxes, or an actual incentive where a company may not pay sales tax on equipment and materials. Mm-hmm. Those are basic, and then there's an issue with mortgage tax. Those might have to be paid back if you don't fulfill what you're required to fulfill. So somebody has to stay on top of that besides our compliance officer. It can't just be a report is made and just goes away and never goes anywhere. It comes back to the policy, and we have had that, and I do look on that as an important feature of the policy committee. And I think we've done a very representative job in protecting the incentive once it's accorded. So the only way you can do that is you have to look at these things, and if it comes up as a problem, you got to deal with it.
Right. And I'm glad that you pointed all that out, because I think, first of all, anytime we can remind our community that the IDA does not write checks, that our incentives are not cash, that they are in fact discounts on future taxes, limited discounts by time and amount. Those, anytime we get to say that on our podcast, we do. just as a reminder.
Well, I've been particularly prickly about that question over my career on the IDA. I think I understood this when I accepted a position on the IDA. I think I understood how it worked. But I can tell you that there were many, many, many very intelligent and thoughtful people in my movement where I come from who did not understand, don't understand, even to this day.
Right.
And they think, and you see it in the newspaper all the time, stop writing checks to XYZ company. There's no checks getting written to XYZ company.
Right.
They make a promise they're going to do something, in return for which they pay less in taxes than they would have otherwise.
Right. They're incentivized to do so. And you're right. Without making that investment, you don't get the discount. So you can't just
let's take the example. That's right. Let's take the example of some building downtown that's just falling apart and there's almost no tax money coming in on it at all.
Right.
And a developer wants to throw, sake of argument, $5 million to rehab a building, but it will put it back on the tax rolls. And the city and the county, or the municipalities that are affected, will receive tax money way over what they did after the incentive after the payment in lieu of, if there's one, expires. They'll go back to full property rate.
Right, which is 5 to 7 years.
That's right. And even before that, they're paying something. And right now, that same building is not paying anything, or is paying so little that it's negligible.
Exactly. Or it's urban blight, it's abandoned.
The real question there is to make sure that, and this is a separate one, it has to do with policy too, Robbie, that we take care to protect the communities plural, where these things are being incentivized. Mm-hmm. We want a vigorous program that benefits women and minority businesses. We want a vigorous program which actually provides for pay equity for jobs that get created or get put in these places. Mm-hmm. We want to have local labor, meaning people who actually live in I think it's 5 counties of Western New York, but mainly Erie County. I mean, you're allowed to have some of your workers come in from the adjoining for construction. We want that money to stay in our community. So we have a labor policy which provides for, I think it's 90%, in some cases 85% of all the work that's done has to be local.
Right.
Now, wise guys will say, well, that means it's all going to be union. Well, no, although a lot of it will be. And I'm proud of that. I think that union jobs have been good for, especially in the construction area, have been good for our community. We pay good wages, they have good benefits, and they're not going away. But it's not about that. It's about providing for incentives to people who are going to invest their money that will result in better economic future for lots and lots of people.
Right.
That's the approach I've taken to this. Now, there are people who say, "Oh, it's only about giving. It's just tax giveaways to the rich." I wish it was that simple. It's not.
Definitely
it's just
not that simple.
It's not that simple because, first of all, the law is the law, and if it wasn't myself and some of the others that have come on the board in the last 11 years, 10 years since the county executive appointed me, the use of this would have been done by somebody else, and it may not have resulted in what I think have been some very, very fine projects that do help the community.
Yeah.
And I'll go one step further on that. The previous county executive didn't do what the current county executive is doing. And that's my personal opinion. That's not the position of the board chair, vice chair, or the policy. Now I'm talking to you as the president of the emeritus, the president of the Labor Federation. I think we had a way too loose system before, and now it's a better system, and it's one which is frankly a little tighter.
I think we're definitely between the county executive's policy influence, between our internal decisions, between state statutes that have changed and become tighter. You're right, and almost all of our recapture policies, our material terms, all of that stuff, we exceed what is required by the state from IDAs. But I wanted to touch on something that you were talking about with, an adaptive reuse example, with
right.
an abandoned building or something. A lot of what we do is kind of community development, and people, I think, miss that part about what an IDA provides. And yes, it is true that most often there's a very high net worth company that is receiving these incentives, but these high net worth companies are also the few that are able to invest $100 million into rehabbing a building or put the financing together, which is another layer of
right.
complication in doing a project. I think a lot of people don't realize that when even a big developer is going to have to sit down with a bank at some point and say, okay, we need to finance this piece, we're going to have this piece, and it's such a complex process. And a lot of times these projects, as we were discussing before, they can live and die on the return that the difference that the IDA incentives make. If the return on investment is a 6 and they need it to be a 5, and our incentives are the difference, well, there you go. Or it might be a larger square footage. It might be a nicer building, et cetera. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think the community development piece very often gets lost. We've talked before in other episodes about the fact that a lot of our results, they're slow burn, right? Like, it's in the paper tomorrow that, this company got XYZ dollars in incentives. But it's 3 years from now that the community is like, wow, look at this great building. It's not
right.
urban blight anymore. There's activity
right.
and shops and people, and it's spurring more development. And this is no longer a dangerous block and blah, blah, blah. So I think it's hard to point at something and say, okay, remember 3 years ago when, so right. That's another reason why we're trying to, through this podcast and other efforts, trying to educate people, because as you said, a lot of smart labor people might not have understood how it works, and how can you blame them? I mean, it's complicated.
That's right. No, exactly correct.
Right.
And the fact that by statute, the president of the Buffalo Central Labor Council, the AFL-CIO's Buffalo branch, which was below us in the charter at the AFL-CIO, the fact though but it's a big labor council, it has a statutory place on the board, is an indication that we can do some good. We can bring some people on who understand economics from that level, from that grassroots level.
Sure.
Then the question is to make the best use, and I've said it twice now, of the incentive power, the power to give abatement, to projects that will benefit the community by bringing more dollars back into it, by getting higher wages on the other side, by providing for tax money that wouldn't have been there otherwise, and encouraging investment by the private sector.
Yeah, and there are two things you mentioned I wanted to highlight too. Number one, there are 14 ex officio or by statute positions on our board of directors, and there are 5 that are jointly appointed by the chair of the county legislature and the current county executive. And a lot of people don't really understand that too, so you have 14 board members who by law have to serve. You know, the mayor of Buffalo is one, the supervisor of Tonawanda, the supervisor of Amherst, as you mentioned, the labor leader in Buffalo. So these are people that the legislature in Albany back in 1970 sat down and said, you know what, we think this would be a good brain trust, and then we'll kind of have this 5 at-large positions for discretion for the local electeds to decide who to put on the board. So as I see the board, there's a lot of insight, a lot of thoughtful discussion. I always bristle when I hear people accuse the IDA board or even the policy committee of being rubber stamp, because boy, oh boy, that's not what I witness. I sit in meetings and I hear, I hear the discussion and the questions.
Oh, this turned out to be a lot more. I'm not complaining, but it was a lot more work than I thought it would be. Yeah, and there's another thing that people should understand. It's a volunteer position.
Correct.
I've never gotten a penny from.
There's no
sitting
stipend.
On the board.
Yeah, there's nothing. They're all voluntary. Right.
There's not even, frankly, there's not even a free lunch in the last 2 years. We haven't even had time to break bread together because of COVID. Right. So it's volunteer. Everybody's on there as volunteer. Some are volunteer. I mean, there are people on there who were appointed who might be even retired. So they're not making anything for their position on this at all.
Right.
That is not understood by the general public.
Correct. Yeah, I've had to explain that to several people who assume that either our board is like a nonprofit board where people contribute, and have a position, or it's like a corporate board where someone says, hey, I think you'd be great. There's no one getting paid. There's a lot of work. Like we said, those 2-inch packets, I mean, my gosh, you have to read so many of those, and you have to also bring to the table, which I think is something that you definitely demonstrate in your leadership, especially the policy committee. You have to bring to the table an institutional knowledge of kind of all things economic development, from the labor standpoint, from the construction standpoint, building, community, politics. There's so many things going on that play a role and sort of shade all of these deals and projects. And it isn't always a question of, okay, well, here's 10 jobs and they're asking for this. Okay, sounds good. Like, that's just not how it happens.
No, it doesn't work that way.
Right. It's okay, well, where is this going? And who are the tenants? And what is this going to bring to the community? And do you have an MWBE hiring outreach program? Are there, is this handicap accessible? Is this, there's all kinds of factors that get raised in the policy committee. And along those lines, along all of the shades of everything that's going on, these myriad layers, I want to ask you about going forward, since we're talking about COVID, just completely changed everybody's world personally and professionally. So here we are trying to figure out how to recover. And the recovery is not overnight, right? It's probably going to take longer than the actual period of the pandemic. So looking forward for the ECIDA Policy Committee, what's on your mind for helping businesses, helping the economy, et cetera, while keeping all of those other things in mind?
Well, we're going to have to see where it goes. I noticed today the unemployment numbers were in, and jobs are still being created on a robust basis. And the unemployment level is quite low. Yet the economy is teetering on a recession. So this is very unusual. And I think it has to do with the fact that there's just a lot of questions as to where to invest and how to invest. And therefore, you could have a slowdown in certain aspects of investment. So that would obviously impact an agency like the ECIDA. Right. So that's one issue. The other issue is we'll have to see where, if there actually is a recession, and it's a typical recession. You can't call it a recession if people are working. But if we start to see an uptick in unemployment and we still have high inflation, then I honestly don't know what role the ECIDA can play and how it can impact positively on that kind of an economic scenario.
That's a really good point too, because I think no matter what happens, I mean, let's all hope that a magic wand gets waved, everything all these problems get solved. But no matter what happens, the IDA is serving a purpose. Incentives can also help a company keep its doors open, and make it through a tough spot, as we saw with COVID and a lot of our policies. And incentives can help a company if they are teetering on whether or not to expand and add jobs. Okay, well, the incentives can encourage that. And then, instead of reacting to the marketplace, we're actually creating the marketplace, right? We're helping to create the growth. But as you said, very pointedly and truthfully, nobody can predict it. I think a lot of people are making predictions, on TV or whatever. You line up 5 economists and they all have 5 different ideas. Yeah. So who knows? But I feel like we have a good system, at least, to evaluate and pivot when we need to and change. And that the whole COVID experience and how the agency reacted, the county executive was incredible and a visionary in organizing the business task force. And, our CEO, John Capolino, he wasted 0 time in, directing the staff to put together loan programs and grant programs. Right. I think our mechanism, like, we're ready for anything, kind of. Right. But you're right. It's a little uncertain, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Richard, we are out of time.
Well, there you go.
But that was great. I want to thank you very much for joining us here on our Get to Know Your IDA podcast. I don't think you can get to know your IDA without getting to know you, our vice chair and policy chair. And I encourage anybody listening, go to our website, ECIDANY.com. and go to the events tab. You can go down to the live stream meetings. You can live stream any of our policy committee meetings, our board meetings, and you'll find it very interesting, I think, just how much true thought and work and discussion and review goes into what we do here. And you can also catch a glimpse of Richard's leadership style.
Well,
I think it's very effective on the policy committee, because you're right. You can, without leadership, you can go round and round and have these great discussions for 2 years.
Right.
So,
let me thank you, Robbie. I think this is a good idea and a wonderful program to continue. And you've done. It's a pleasure being interviewed by you for the purposes of educating people as to the makeup, the role, and work of the ECIDA. So thank you for doing this.
Oh, I appreciate it. And I certainly can't do it without an interviewee. So,
all right.
So back at you. Thank you. And for anybody that's interested in learning more about labor, and why don't you let us know, where can they go? Is there a website where if someone wants to get involved?
Facebook, the Western New York Area Labor Federation's Facebook page is a very active one, has lots and lots of followers, and every day there's new stuff, and it announces activities and programs and political and social positions, etc. Events. That's where I would go.
Okay. Great. And if you would like more information about the ECIDA or any of its products, also the rest of our podcasts, I don't know where you're listening to us right now, but we're on Spotify and Apple and Audible and everywhere else podcasts are. So go to ECIDANY.com and there's a whole bunch of information there. And you can also call us. We are not an anonymous, faceless organization, as I sometimes joke, like the Wonka factory behind the gates. We are real people, so you can call us, and we will help explain and talk to you about whatever your business needs are. So thanks for listening, everybody. Thank you very much, Richard Lipsitz, our vice chair and our chair of our policy committee, and we will see you guys next time.